Hi, I'm Jess Altano, and this is the video presentation on my research on the effects of note-taking on retention. So here's the abstract. It's on the second slide. I'm not going to read it to you because I'm about to this is the presentation, but you're welcome to read it on the second slide if you'd like a more condensed version of what happened during the study. So the problem I was having is that my students definitely lacked in note-taking skills. Because my students tend to be lower level, including IEP or students who are just lower in motivation in my forensic science classes, whereas it's an elective for seniors, the notes that we provide for them are pretty much all of the notes. We don't really give them anything that they need to write down specifically on their own. We provide all the notes for them. And we do require them to write notes, but it turns out that when they do write the notes, they're literally just writing every single word down. There's not really any processing happening. It's just writing word for word what's on the slide. So my question was, is there a better way to do this? So I started delving into the research on really what makes notes and note-taking methods, and not surprisingly, the research indicated that students who take notes tend to retain information than those who do not. So that wasn't really a big surprise. There's sort of two main purposes according to the research on notes. One of them is for encoding, so in other words, how the information translates to the brain. And the other is to alleviate brain bandwidth. So you write things down as you're doing a complex math, for example, because your mental math can only take you so far, type thing. So we're going to be focusing on the encoding one for this research. I also found in the research that although high school teachers today tend to use a variety of different methods to teach, and it's much different than it used to be, right, where everything used to be rote memorization. So because of that, there's less of an emphasis on notes than there used to be. But at the same time, in college, the lecture style is the one that tends to be used overwhelmingly. More than 70% of the time, college professors are still using lecture as their main avenue for delivering content. And so notes are just as important as ever, especially in trying to retain lecture information. And also, taking notes is the beginning of the encoding process. It's the beginning of the learning process. It's like the studying that's happening for the students before the studying even begins. So, very important for the students to be able to take notes. I also found that many students are not taught a specific note-taking method. I know that many of them are taught, like, well, don't write every single thing down, or put it in your own words, but beyond that, they're not taught a certain method or much detail beyond that. And a lot of them get to college, these high school students, without ever being taught how to take notes. So, because they have no skills in note-taking, many of the students, like mine, use, according to the research, this verbatim method, which is not very effective because there's not very much processing happening. It's literally just writing down exactly word for word what you see and thinking as little as possible. Additional research shows that the Cornell method is actually one of the most effective note-taking methods, and it's one of the most effective essentially in part because it tends to make the learner reflect on what they're doing. It's very open-ended, and it's got 3 different sections. There's a note section, a cue section so that the student can refer themselves back to that spot in the notes, and a summary section at the bottom. So all of these kind of force the reflection, and students write in their own style, and they kind of see it, they write it as they perceive it. So much different than just writing the teacher's version. And then separately, there was another study that showed that the more students felt that notes were important, the better their GPA tended to be. So that was something else I was interested in seeing. But so for the note-taking methods, another article was talking about sort of the pros and cons. So a Cornell note method, one of the pros is that it forces deeper interaction with the material. The better interaction, it seemed in my research, that the students could take and really dig into the material, notes-wise, the better they retained. But one of the cons with that was that there's a myriad of different skills that are used when taking notes, especially in an open-ended method like Cornell notes. You've got to listen to find the important things and not write everything down. You got to be writing and listening at the same time, essentially, and there's just all kinds of different executive functioning happening while taking Cornell notes, and you might miss some important things because you're just if you're still trying to write it all down, or you're not very good at Cornell notes. So that could be a major problem. And it just could be very taxing to the students. There's a lot to do. It could be exhausting. So I wanted to contrast that with the fill-in-the-blank notes method, which is different in the sense that the information is very targeted. So the students are provided 90% of the information, but they're still writing in the sense that they have to fill in these blanks, so there's still writing happening to help retention. So that's what's good for that. It's very targeted, and they can listen while writing at the same time, which may not be as possible in the Cornell method. But one of the cons of that method is that they can fill in the blanks without really interacting very much at all with the material. They could just do blank hunting, and that's, they're only going to do as much as they really have to do, some of the students, so that could be all that's done essentially, is that. So not very much interaction with the material then, but that particular study was saying, especially for lower level students, this might be the best method for them, as sort of best of both worlds, because if something's too open-ended, it's too taxing. So my research questions were, do high school students prefer better retain information from one note-taking method over another? Do they do better with one versus another? Is it the same? And how do my students' preferences relate to their academic success? Do they do better if they feel better about notes? And what experience do my students have with instruction on taking notes? So were they ever even told a method? And finally, what notes format, if any format, do they prefer? So regardless of how well they do with the method, what do they like the best? Was my question. So my participants were 55 senior forensic science students at the high school where I work in New Jersey. 5 of them were male and 50 of them were female. And of those, 34 of them were from my classes, 21 were from my co-workers' classes. And the high school's population is about 65% white, 26% Asian, 6% Hispanic, 2% two or more other races, and 1% African American. It's also an affluent district, and it's also one of the top performing districts in the state of New Jersey and in the country. So, the design for the study, there were 4 videos that all the students watched. I monitored whether they watched them on the PlayPosit software, and then they did notes. So they took their notes, they either printed off the notes and then wrote on them, and then took a picture of it and uploaded it into Google Classroom, or they annotated the notes directly using a software called Kami and uploaded it into the same place, Google Classroom, all in the same organized place. And then after each video, after each notes, there was an assessment which was a Google form the students knew did not count against their grade. So they were just supposed to try their best, and they were simply told, this is a self-check, doesn't hurt or help you, it's just a way to check to see how you're doing so far in the unit. So, and this is just mentioning that again, the only thing that I didn't include was that there was a survey at the very end as well, a Google Forms survey, which asked them about their preferences on notes, as well as if they were ever given any previous instruction on notes. So this is how the study played out, where the first 2 assessments, Cohort A, which happened to be my period 5 and 6 classes, did the Cornell notes for those assessments as they watched the video lessons. And Cohort B, which was my period 7, for that same video lessons, did the fill-in-the-blank method instead. And then the Cohort C, which was my co-workers class, they did their own choice of notes. So it could have been no notes, or it could have been whatever notes they wanted. Their notes were not collected. So my students' notes were always collected to verify. So in order to qualify for the study for Cohort A and B, the 2 intervention groups, they had to have completed the video on time before the assessment, and they had to have completed the notes on time before the assessment for all 4 assessments. So many students were disqualified because they couldn't do both of those during this year. But that's how you had to qualify. And then Cohort C, the only thing they had to do to qualify, in order to not push them toward one note method or another, all that they had to do was watch the video lesson in order to qualify. For assessments 3 and 4, it was switched, where Cohort A then did the fill-in-the-blank notes, Cohort B then did the Cornell notes instead. And both times for the Cornell notes, the students were provided a primer video lesson on how to do those notes effectively. Just a short clip provided by the Cornell website. Yeah, and then so the consent forms were not collected until after the research was done, because I didn't want the students to change their behavior if they knew the research was being done on them. But I also didn't use their data unless they consented after the fact. And they also did a survey after all of these assessments, and they weren't told until after the survey that it was part of the study, because I didn't want to bias their answers at all. Okay, so the analysis. So cohorts A and B had the same sample size because they were the same students that swapped. So I was able to do a paired t-test for that. Cohort C was a whole different group of students and a whole different numbers, so there were separate t-tests done for them. And then the students were surveyed with Likert type questions where a 5 meant completely agree and a 1 meant completely disagree type thing. And then they were given yes or no questions in this survey as well. So here's how the data came out. So each of the times, just without even doing an analysis, you could tell the Cornell notes outperformed the other methods every single time of the 4 assessments. And what was interesting for that is that even when the students were swapped, it happened. So initially I thought perhaps it's just that my cohort A, my group A, tends to be stronger students academically. But when group A used the fill-in-the-blank method, their average was lower both times than the students group that used the Cornell method. So that was pretty compelling evidence that the Cornell was the stronger method. Also, with the paired t-test, it showed that the Cornell notes method was statistically significantly better than the fill-in-the-blank method. So not just better, but significantly better statistically. And the Cornell notes method was also shown in another t-test comparing Cornell notes to student choice of notes as being better. And when I compared the fill-in-the-blank notes with a t-test to the student choice of notes, you can tell up here that it's better 3 out of 4 times, but it was not statistically significantly better. So it did tend to outperform the student choice of notes, but not statistically significantly better in the analysis that I did. So this was looking at the students' feelings on notes. So again, 5 was strongly agree for each of the questions posed at the bottom. I was looking for there to be a trend. These students are split into 3 groups based on quiz average. So students who did 85 and above, students who did from 70 to 84%, and students who did 69% and below. But there wasn't a clear pattern. There wasn't a trend in one direction or the other as far as how strongly they felt about taking notes versus how well they did on the quizzes. So no real correlation there. This was whether the students had any prior experience on taking notes. So about 58% of the students, or 32 of them, did have experience with it, and about 42% of them did not have, according to them, previous experience in taking notes. It's worth noting too that of the students who said yes, they did have previous experience, those students had things like don't write every word down, or don't write every word down. What was the other one? Put it in your own words. Those are kind of the broad things. So they included those as instructions on note-taking, but many of them did not say, yes, I was told to use a specific method. It was more just like general instructions. Okay, so this was the student preferences. Which method did they like better? For both the intervention group, so my students and my coworker students, that was the non-intervention group, the control group, both overwhelmingly preferred, quote-unquote, their own method. Even though we know that in the control group, the Cornell method won out overwhelmingly in that group as well. But they still said that. So this could indicate that student preferences does not align with how well, like what's best for them. Maybe students don't know what's best for them, essentially. The intervention students, one of the students actually said, I also prefer not to take notes at all. 41% of them preferred the fill-in-the-blank method. And in the other group, they actually had one student say they did prefer the Cornell method. But otherwise, there was no mention of it, even though it was by far the best method. So, what I learned was that the Cornell method does seem to be, even with my students, the best method, at least for female students, because my students were overwhelmingly female in the study. But the students tend to prefer their own note-taking method, even though the Cornell note method may be better for them. And many of the students have never been explicitly taught a note-taking method. So that could change my instruction in the future. I'm definitely going to be teaching them about how to do this in the beginning of the year from now on. How it contributed to the research. So there was more, this is another study to add to the body of research saying that the Cornell note-taking method is the better method. This also contributes to sort of a virtual study because this is one of the first times it was done in this hybrid, so that's virtual environment. And it also provides an example of the Cornell method performing statistically significantly better than the fill-in-the-blank method, which previous studies found a difference, but not statistically significantly different. What I would do in the future, what I would change, one is I would have all the assessments performed in person. So unfortunately, because of this hybrid environment, I can't confirm that students took the assessments without their notes. My gut tells me they did not use their notes, which is they were not supposed to, but I can't confirm that. So it kind of takes away from the strength of my study because of that. So in the future, I would do that in person. I would also, because I'm doing it in person and requiring it, I think that would have more males in the study. So turns out that my classes already had many more females for whatever reason than males. Maybe it's because it's an elective, or more students who are more academically inclined, or for whatever reason sign up. I'm not really sure the reasoning, but yeah. So I would at least like to have more of my male students be able to qualify next time around by requiring them in person, because it was the hybrid model that made them not finish in time. And in the future, I would also have the same group of students try all 3 interventions. In this study, I had 2 of the groups do 2 different interventions and a whole separate group being the control, and it kind of took away from the strength of my argument. It would have been a much stronger argument if I showed better results amongst the same students shuffling through. In the future, finally, I would also test whether handwriting versus typing out the notes makes a difference in terms of retention. And I would also compare the students' notes to their GPA and not their quiz performance, because there was just too many confounding variables I found. I was trying to compare it to their quiz performance, but I also changed what note-taking method they did. So too many variables at once, too much to keep track of. So that's for my research. I hope that you learned as much as I did. Thanks.